Please listen until the end because I don't think you've ever heard about this before concerning what goes on with our electromagnetic grid of the Earth, having to do with our consciousness, with our health, with telecommunications, with blind spots that make airplanes believe they're somewhere where they're not. Even plane accidents have happened this way. Also the Schumann resonance and extraterrestrials and UFOs. So these scientists explain all this, and this is really an eye-opener and very important, and it has to do with what Nikola Tesla was trying to tell us about frequencies and electromagnetic frequencies. And you should listen until the end. Thank you. Earth's energy grid and the secret war for its control, according to what scientist Angelos Arvanis writes, in the circles of the most innovative researchers, the discovery that our planet is surrounded by an energy grid that connects all living creatures and tunes the brains of people to a common frequency has been discussed in recent years. Of course, the ancients knew about this because we know that they built their temples on these ley lines, and the temples usually had pillars, columns, and these columns were taking the energy from the ley line grid, the nodes of the ley lines, and the people that would come to visit the temple, passing or leaning on these columns, would find it beneficial if they were sick in some way, because this electric field would enter their bodies and bring them into a type of a balance, a health balance. Now, these innovative researchers discovered our planet surrounded by these energy grids. One of the first scientists who presented this topic to the public is our much discussed from earlier appearances on Fellow Traveler, as well as enigmatic Greek-American oceanologist and ecobiologist, Angelos Arvanis. In the bold text that follows, Mr. Arvanis reveals the incredible behind the scenes on the investigations that revealed the existence of the grid, and he talks about his personal involvement in the matter and openly denounces the silence of one of the strangest discoveries of our time, but also the struggle, its exploitation with unknown results for our planet. In the early 1980s, he said, I worked with the research center of the partnership of the multinational companies C&W, Mercury, and Valtech. They built the then state-of-the-art optical fiber network in the Atlantic Ocean and the Mediterranean Sea, which today makes the evolutionary telecommunications of the countries of the world possible. For those who don't know, this network is what today allows, for example, the operation of the internet. Special cables pass through the sea and cross huge ocean distances. So companies need the help of many marine specialists, oceanographers that is, to deal with the wide range of problems. I do not consider, he says, it necessary to analyze them because these are technical issues such as material deterioration, chemical reactions of seawater with the plastics, and metals of submarine networks, sea monsters, etc. The international groups of experts are active in such work, and their selection of their often secret purposes is another long story. As an oceanographic research consultant, I had undertaken a very specific task, the study of the effect of a certain class of marine microorganisms on network cables. At first, I thought that the companies were mainly interested in finding ways to combat cable wear, but later I realized that they were concerned with something completely different. They were having problems transporting signals. When cables passed through certain areas, any signal they tried to send through them was lost, attenuated, or filled with interference. It had, as we say, leaked. For example, when a signal was sent from New York to Lisbon via an undersea cable that passed through the Azores Island complex, the signal lost much of its strength or did not reach at all. When it was sent via a completely different route, further north over Ireland, the signal did not drop at all. It was as if the route helped it, even if the cable length was doubled. This was true for fiber optic cables as well as for traditional shielded copper cables, which were then laid where the seabed works. The problem did not seem to me to be directly related to my own specialization in ecobiology and oceanography, and at first I wondered about the exact criteria for the selection of me and my collaborators, my colleagues. It was clear that the problem was more related to some unknown electromagnetic phenomena of the planet's atmosphere. As I found out later, some special technicians of radio communications and radar knew the problem and attributed it to the electromagnetic vortices, the vortexes that manifest in some parts of the planet. At the time, they thought that these eddies were random events produced by some irregularities in the surface of the Earth or the bottom of the seas. But as I later found out, the companies wanted our opinion because some had noticed that on the bad routes, that is, on those where the signal was leaking, certain layers of living organisms grew on the surface of the cables, while on the good routes, where the signals were strong, the cables remained perfectly clear. Because there was a suspicion that some living organism might affect or block the magnetic fields, they asked for the cooperation of specialized researchers in order to establish whether the difficulty of communication was not only responsible for some electromagnetic phenomenon, but also some unknown marine animal species that appeared in certain places of the bottom. Without any of us realizing it at the time, we had already caught the tip of the thread that later led us, me and several others, to one of the greatest and most shocking discoveries of all time, that around our planet there is a huge energy grid, effectively not only the atmosphere and weather or telecommunications, but also the vital energy and thought of the living organizations and people. Wow. This grid, although probably natural, we now realize that it can be controlled. In fact, in my opinion, there is enough evidence to indicate that some ancient civilizations knew of the existence of this electromagnetic grid, as well as the secrets of its use. Unfortunately, this realization triggered the outbreak of a secret war between governments, multinational companies, and intelligence agencies, but also clubs of people seeking power, for who will be the first to discover the most secrets hidden in it all. In these circles, it's widely believed that whoever discovers the first how to use all the possibilities of the grid will be able to transmit or absorb through the grid energy of all kinds from all over the planet, even vital energy with which he may be able to achieve and his personal immortality. It's also believed that through the grid, it's possible for someone with directed emissions to change the behavior and psyche of the mass of people, because it's possible with some particularly complex, albeit theoretical applications, for example with telepathic transmissions, to impose new morphogenic structures, archetypes, or thought forms, hence the basic elements that create our psyche and our perceptual environment. It's believed that in the same way it can cause revolutions and stop wars, cause or neutralize global epidemics, and most important of all is the belief that it can perhaps mutate the human condition, tuning people's perceptions to a higher or lower level. I will explain below what we mean by all this. Lately, there's been an intense effort to reveal and decipher the secrets of the grid. Many texts claim to have traced the geomagnetic placement of ancient temples around the world, which were built on the nodes of the grid, and several writers and researchers have figured out roughly what is going on. Also, for those who follow these kinds of developments, the efforts made in recent years by U.S. military to decipher and affect the operation of the grid through the HARP program have already been revealed. I state unequivocally that HARP was not an ionospheric study program or a secret microwave radiation weapon, as some have suspected, but a reverse engineering effort, an effort to study and understand in an oblique way the workings of the planetary grid. The knowledge of monitoring and exploiting the grid has so far not fallen into the wrong hands. No one can boast of knowledge, knowing it all in detail exactly how this is controlled, but there is a need to turn the world's interest on it to make its existence known to everyone, to understand these discoveries as quickly as possible, not only because some may be getting closer to deciphering its secrets, but also because of technologically, in our evolution, we have created in the grid, perhaps unwittingly, disturbances that may prove to be disastrous. I'm publishing this text only to help diffuse the chain reaction of information already traveling to its recipients and affecting the setting for action to be taken. My own contact with the question of the grid began when I was working with the Ecobiology Department of the San Francisco Oceanographic Institute. I was then a member of the think tank we call Epsilon, which was funded by the non-American fund. Mr. Arvanis has talked about this group in interviews in previous issues of Strange. As I have told you before, we had already experienced a strange phenomenon of teleporting a dolphin from one end of the planet to the other. We had identified pyramids in underwater locations with no explanation as to their origin. What is going on? There were colleagues of mine who, studying the nature of energy, had found that the energy flow can be amplified thousands of times if channeled through some very strict geometric paths. I've also spoken to you of our group's realization that forms, that is shapes, whether perceptual or objective, imaginary or real, affect human will in unfathomable but very powerful ways. I will ask you to get back to these texts to connect what I say there with all that I will analyze below. I had also worked, as I have related before, under Dr. John Lilly, the most revolutionary researcher of the 20th century, who dealt with human perception and is the pioneer explorer of dolphin intelligence, who dared to speak openly about human contact with alien intelligences. Amazing. And because of this relationship of my past, I was at that time in the crosshairs of some disgraceful sections of certain intelligence agencies. And then I was contacted by the Mercury people. What? The Mercury people, who were looking for expert researchers to study the mysteries of the areas that block the cable signal. It must not have been more than a week after the initial consultations and exchanges of information with the Mercury Research Office when I was visited by some government officials with Army Scientific Research Office IDs and informed me that they were very interested in the underwater surveys of the multinational companies that built the transatlantic cables. They wanted me to pass on whatever information came to my attention about some routes the cables would take, which areas would be avoided, and what secondary technologies would be used. If they pressed me more, I could not refuse, but they did not particularly insist. These visits were repeated several times. They were asking me about various strange and irrelevant details. Paradoxically, these questions later helped me as well, indirectly pointing me in directions and giving me useful information to proceed with the research of some very important issues. This interest of the Army troubled me greatly at the time. I immediately thought of the Eastern Atlantic region, where the huge Cyclopean seawalls had recently been discovered, right where the cables were meant to pass. I didn't know that we had Cyclopean seawalls at the Eastern Atlantic, off the American coast. This is ridiculous. Amazing. So I contacted some people who had inside information, and I tried to find out exactly what was going on. The most important answers I received were three. None of them were directly related to the underwater ruins. This is, I have to admit, extremely fascinating. Now, he says the first was that various techniques were rumored to exist which, if implemented, might allow telecommunication cables to detect the neutrons emitted by the nuclear reactors of nuclear submarines, so that those controlling the undersea cable network could trace the location and path of such submarines. The second answer contained an additional revelation. There were areas of the planet which radars cannot in any way see because of the so-called Schumann magnetic resonance. These areas are called blind spots and are located where the Earth's magnetism takes a sort of detour and creates holes in the electromagnetic field. If the enemy knows them, he can place there, for example, swarms of aircraft which cannot be detected by radar, except by visual contact, and which in case of war will appear out of nowhere to strike their targets. I know that such points also exist in Greek space, and in Greece, however, it's easy to set up observation posts and cover them or use them to place surprises on potential invaders. In the ocean, there is no one to notice the hundreds of blind spots. Precisely because there are regions of electromagnetic anomaly, they are avoided even by satellites, which do not normally pass over them. So I thought the Army might have assumed that the measurements the companies made in the different ocean regions would allow them to construct a map that contains these blind spots. The third answer came from my colleague, Dr. John Dreher, and it proved to be prophetic, although it did not invalidate the previous two. Dr. Dreher told me that the issue of the wiring of the entire planet, the grid that is, by private and multinational companies was clearly of interest in governments because it promoted the interest of globalization, which at the time had begun to be warmly supported by the multinationals. There was a group of private individuals of great power, multi-millionaires like the Englishman Rupert Murdoch, like the German Albright family or the Nahyan sheikhs of Saudi Arabia, who with their money had built multinational giants that no government could face. You see, back then, the governments tried to fight the multinationals by every illegal or legitimate means, but they didn't achieve anything special because the multinational money went into many pockets and influenced consciousness. The private, quote-unquote, wiring of the entire planet would be an all-powerful tool in the hands of the multinationals because it would allow their subsidiaries in every country to communicate and do all kinds of business with each other without giving any account to local governments. Several governments at the time had every reason to closely monitor the networking of the planet because from then on, it seemed that the information revolution was approaching that would change the political and military balances, just as it did a few years later with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, 3 years after completion of the transatlantic fiber optic network, which was done in 1988. But they could not do anything because all this had been initiated many years before by the real rulers of the planet, certainly not by those who appear. The fiber optic network and the internet were designed as early as 1950, but it was not the artificial internet that really interested the specific government employees, nor the blind spots or the detection of nuclear submarines, but the planetary internet, the grid. In September 1983, about a year after I started working at C&W Mercury, the Army people visited me again. I was asked something seemingly unrelated to my work. If I had heard of the people I worked with about the fatal crash of Korean jumbo jet 747 that was shot down September 1st, 1983 by a Russian missile, why had it invaded Russian airspace? The plane belonged to the Korean airline KAL Flight 007 and was destroyed at 3:27 a.m. Japan time. The accident had actually been discussed by some of my associates because the particular area the plane was flying, that is the area between the Aleutian Islands of Alaska and Petropavlovsk on the Siberian Kamchatka Peninsula, was one of the first that had been studied for laying fiber optic cables that they would unite America with Japan. I knew that there was the same problem in the area as there was in the Azores area, that there was a leakage problem in the islands, and that radar blind spots had also been identified. As I did not judge that there was any secret in it at all, I conveyed this information to them, believing that it would help to clarify the causes of the downing of the aircraft. And then my teammates did a little research on the incident. We discovered that the Korean pilot of KAL 007, in his last communication with the Hokkaido control tower before the aircraft was destroyed at 3:18 a.m., stated that the aircraft was in a position 115 miles south of Hokkaido, The radar told him that the pilot was wrong because it was seeing him at 230 miles further north in Russian airspace. The Korean pilot panicked when he heard the answer because he had flown most of the route on autopilot and kept the compass steady and normally should not have deviated at all from his course. Immediately after that, he started broadcasting SOS. But the Soviet fighters that had already approached him had been ordered to shoot down and fired missiles because they saw an unidentified Western aircraft heading towards Russian populated areas. The Soviet pilots could not coordinate with the international radio communication channels at the time because their superiors were afraid that they would defect, so they did not even hear the SOS of the fatal aircraft. The result was that innocent people were just unjustly lost their lives. The incident was not the first time. If it was unique, we'd think there was just some autopilot problem, but the incident was repeated almost in the same area. KAL Flight 902, April 20th, 1978, was similarly found in Murmansk, Russia, instead of Anchorage, Alaska. Can you imagine? 5,000 kilometers away. This is ridiculous. There she was, and also shot down by Russian missiles, fell into the frozen lake. The pilot, Kim Kyu, was a veteran, and it was impossible for him to have made such an outrageous mistake. When he later apologized to the survivors of the flight, he stated that something very strange had happened to his compass, and other similar incidents happened. I wonder if this also takes place at the Bermuda Triangle. Now, these incidents were inexplicable to everyone else, but it was obvious to those of us who knew that there were lines on Earth's surface on the grid where the magnetic fields follow their own paths, quite different from those predicted by the theories that had been in force until then. We understood that anything moving along these lines was entering a kind of parallel reality, quote unquote, so to speak, an alternate map of Earth, and was losing time and space. Even so-called UFOs have been observed to usually move along these lines. Amazing, isn't it? A few years later, in the wider area where the strange plane crashes took place in Gakona, Alaska, HAARP was set up to decipher the energy anomalies of the area. It took a lot of study and research to understand what was going on with the magnetic lines and the blockage or leaking of the energy following along them. An amazing study by Soviet scientists from 1975 came into our hands, which solved a large part of the mystery. This study belongs to Dr. Nikolai Goncharov, historian, Dr. Vyacheslav Morozov, engineer, and Dr. Valery Makarov, electronics, who analyzed data collected by Soviet satellites about the anomalies of the Earth's surface and concluded that the Earth's tectonic plates formed a dodecahedron solid, and the planet's surface formed a regular icosahedron, that's 20-sided thing, right? Block. The Soviets realized that our planet was like a huge crystal that pulsated with mathematical precision as if it had been designed by some unknown extraterrestrial engineers. The Greeks in our group, we recognized in the dodecahedron of the tectonic plates the secret solid of Pythagoras, and one that Pythagoras kept strictly hidden and threatened his students with the death penalty if they revealed it. Wow! The faces of the dodecahedron are made of pentagons. Pythagoras knew that the Earth is made of elementary geometric symmetries and solids. Plato, bearer of Pythagoras' knowledge, reported to Phaedo that the Earth looks like a sphere sewn from 12 pieces of leather. In the study of the Russians, there was also drawn a map of the Earth wrapped in a strange grid. When we found that the nodal points of the grid were we began to understand that we had before us the edge of many mysteries, but also the discovery of a new great mystery. Among the grid points of the Soviet map were the Great Pyramid of Giza, Hudson Bay, a place where the North Magnetic Pole is located, the Pyramids of Zion, Hamakulia near Hawaii, the place where the disappeared teleported dolphin I was telling you about, the Bimini Islands, where the largest Cyclopean walls were ever discovered, the Nazca Valley in Peru, Easter Island, Antarctica, and Gabon, where natural radioactive reactors were discovered. I will explain in short what is happening. On the surface of the Earth, there is an etheric grid of transmission and propagation of energy, which causes the concentration of this energy in certain places and does not allow its diffusion to others. If a wire intersects a certain long line of the grid, then the signal traveling through the wire, whether photonic or electric, tries to escape from it, follow the line, and thus cause standing waves and interference. Our first finding was that the grid not only causes magnetic or electrical energy to be deflected, but life energy as well. And as we later discovered, the so-called spiritual or psionic energy as well. For this reason, the cables that had interfered developed unusual layers of microorganisms, while other cables were clean. Our conclusion was and is that all different energies are probably actually one energy, one, let's say, basic energy, which due to various geometric transformations of frequency and configuration mutates into the energies we know. When it moves in metals, it becomes electricity or magnetism. And when it passes through the living body, it becomes bioenergy. In vacuum, it is photons. In the air, it is sound, etc. Of course, this is a highly heretical conclusion. This transformation continues even in non-material fields, such as that of information, where we have the creation of thought forms or mimes, as evolutionary biologists we call them today. And finally, the field of the will, which is the spiritual realm where we have the creation of living entities or consciousnesses. You understand that these considerations border on the occult. Between us, we call the basic unformed energy the Force, quote unquote, because at the time cinemas were playing Star Wars, in which the space Jedi Knights used the Force, which flowed through all living creatures to accomplish incredible feats. May the Force be with you, type of thing. Let me take this opportunity to fill in something that is not well known. A program of the U.S. Army at the time in the 1980s called Psionic Soldiers Jedi, and this program was started before the first Star Wars movie. At first, we thought the whole thing was a coincidence, but later we learned that George Lucas had quite a lot of information on the subject, since we were not the first to discover it, but there were many who explored it before us. Another transformation of energy produces matter, all that we see around us. We could say that matter is produced by the condensation of energy, by compressing a large amount of it at a point in space and dropping it to a lower vibration, that is, a lower frequency. Exactly what the equation E equals mc2 describes. The condensation or stopping of the energy flow, hence the conversion of matter into energy, which we jokingly called alchemical condensation, happens calmly without violent manifestations, and reminds me of the conception of the sperm from the egg, but the release of energy from the matter. It always causes a violent shock, ignition, bang, terror, etc. All of you, all of us, are this energy, and that has been quietly condensed into matter and will be converted again at some point into energy with a violent discharge, which we call death. In any case, ecobiology studies show that the points in space that facilitate the flow of energy and were usually clean were those that were harmful to life, while those that impeded the flow were those in which life developed much more easily. But they were immediately filled with all sorts of creatures, viruses, and diseases. The unhindered flow of energy always causes a kind of sterilization. With this realization, we began to look around for various phenomena of energy condensation and release. We found areas where nothing ever grew and put loose soil and seeds there. We sheltered it from the winds and watered it, but nothing grew. Instead, we found places where some plants were growing in the concrete that the engineers had placed a few years ago. Little plants breaking through the concrete, coming out into the sun, as if there was an all-powerful concentration of life energy there. Little by little, we began to understand the basic secrets of energy flow. We experimented with the ancient rules of spatial planning, hence spatial planning is also the popular Chinese feng shui, and achieved incredible results. We placed metal rods in a pentagonal formation around the barren area of the previous example, tied them with copper wire, and the area became fertile. We placed powerful electromagnets in places that intersected with the magnetic lines of the area and killed all trees and mouse nests without having to spray drug or even get close to them, just driving the energy through them. Some groups discovered roads in crowded cities of the United States where no business was able to make a profit, and they all closed idle, while they identified places where profits were guaranteed for their residents. It's said that on some failed streets they built walls, painted them with a special metal alloy, and after a few months these streets were filled with shops and full of pockets. But there were many times when using such techniques that I mentioned to you, either you lose control and you don't achieve much, or it causes something completely opposite to what you want to achieve. Often energy seems to have a will of its own. Another important observation of ours was that the phenomenon of telepathy, ESP, remote viewing, or prediction of events were always related to specific positions and orientations related to the grid. An experimenter could more easily transmit his thought to a medium if both were in a line of the energy grid, and there were places where even the strongest medium lost his abilities. I'm not afraid to talk so openly about all this anymore because they have more or less become known to all those who deal with spatial planning and the environment. A large number of scientists and researchers have begun to observe and understand even a little of the secrets of the energy grid. At the end of the 1980s, the research on zero-point energy flared up, which was based on the observation of the flow of energy created at the points of zero mass, hence in empty space. We and many others then realized that energy not only produces matter, this is also what Nikola Tesla told us, but also empty space, and we began to study ways in which we could draw energy out of nothing, where energy should be stronger but also more destructive. Perhaps, fortunately, zero-point energy has not yet been conquered. Those with knowledge of physics may understand that these are all applications of the unified field theory, which we have somehow mastered, although it's not yet fully understood. In highly qualified research circles, it's rumored that Einstein had completed his work on the unified field, but did not dare to publish it because he feared the results of its use by some people who dropped nuclear bombs on popular areas of Japan. Now, who currently owns these works is a question. Another finding we had arrived at was that very violent explosions, such as those of a nuclear bomb, are contained by the grid. For a nuclear bomb to explode, it must be placed on a specific location between the lines of the planetary grid, and it does not explode wherever and whenever people want it to. Unfortunately, there are now charts showing when and where a nuclear bomb can be detonated. When the first fiber optic cables began to be laid on the bottom of the ocean in 1985, the annoyances from the army people and all kinds of government officials started to subside. They had probably now drawn the facts on or conclusions they needed to create their own program of study of the Earth's energy grid, and were no longer interested in the information that independent researchers would give them. The map by the famous researcher Evan Sanderson, in which he marks places where gravitational anomalies are encountered, the coincidence, quote unquote, with the nodal points of the grid is not at all accidental. I must add that an important discovery regarding planetary energy was the discovery of the so-called psychic tracks or psi tracks. In 1987, the Swedish painter Gulf Andersson realized that just as the material form affects the mental function and activates the area of the brain for the observer. The opposite also happens. A mental function about a material object causes a flow of energy from the brain to the object. Anderson made this discovery by accident. One day he thought of using his grandfather, who was a powerful clairvoyant, to locate an object he had lost. He created a detailed picture of the object in his mind and asked his grandfather to find it without telling him exactly what he was looking for. And indeed, his grandfather found the item. But at the same time, the grandfather noticed that in the space between his grandson and the object, a trail of energy had been created, which did not go out immediately but remained there for some time. Perplexed, the grandson assumed that there must be something else in the area where the object was located, which was probably affecting his wand viewer, so he moved the object and hid it in another place. He then asked his grandfather to probe the space again to ascertain what it was that he felt there. But his grandfather found a different path, which led him to the object's new hiding place. Anderson was taken aback and contacted several more dowsers to repeat the experiment. The result was always the same. When someone thought intensely about an object, it caused an energy pathway from their brain to the object, which wand readers could detect. I guess the dowser wands, the people that find water, they hold that three-pronged branch. Now, it sounds incredible, but this path did not disappear when man stopped to think about it, but remained in the same space for some time. But when the object moved, then the path moved with it and continued to point to the object. The painter even informed the Stockholm University of Technology, where he collaborated with the physicist Jens Tellefsen, who helped him complete his research and give it all the necessary scientific characteristics. The two researchers later formulated the theory of psychic traces, quote unquote. The further research of the phenomenon is currently financed by the family of one of the richest people in the world, the Swedish multimillionaire Ingmar Kamprad. Researchers of the phenomenon have noticed that psychic traces are also connected to the planetary grid. In some places and times, the creation of the psychic trail is easy and the flow of energy is stronger, while in other places and times, the trail is difficult to create and fades away almost immediately. It's exactly the same psychic energy as it is for electromagnetic energy. The most ancient civilizations built their temples in specific points of the energy grid, as we know, with the ancient Greeks, the ancient Egyptians, a specific orientation and special construction materials. They also believed that there were two kinds of holy places, the whites and the blacks. The white places were those where the sterilizing force, which is opposed to life but activates the spirit and cleans the human body, flows unceasingly, and in the black places energy is trapped, life is magnified and ends up in orgiastic forms, but vital energy also accumulates there. So when they wanted to help a weak person, they let him reside for a short time in the black space. On the contrary, a psychopath or a seriously ill person in need of energy cleansing, they took him to a white place in a wasteland away from the orgiastic vegetation, apparently so that the energy flow would dissolve the uncontrolled bioenergetic formations. It sounds simplistic and certainly does not solve all the problems of medicine and biology, but it is criminal that this knowledge is considered forbidden, although it is now studied by hundreds of scientists and researchers around the world. Many biologists and doctors have worked on the previous observations, who have also developed theories to explain the phenomena. After World War II, the German Ernst Hartmann was the first to develop one theory that coincides remarkably with the rest of the observations. Hartmann calculated the thickness and position of the energy lines, found them to be 21 centimeters wide. That's not much. It's about the size of our hand, and form a grid consisting of lines 6 meters apart. on the north-south axis and 2.5 meters on the east-west axis, Hartman believes that the points of intersection of these lines are dangerous to health. Dr. Manfred Curry later developed the theory that each line of the planetary grid carries electrical charges. This is what the ancient Greeks knew. That's why they built their temples on the Earth grid nodes. Now, at the points where the energy lines of the planetary grid cross, if the energy charge is two positive charges, we have overgrowth of the cells, while if there are two negative charges, inflammations develop. The German Dr. Neiper developed the theory of geopathogenic zones, which can be located with special devices and coincide with Hartman's lines and Curry's lines. All this coincides with the obsession of the former surgeon Ferdinand Sauerbach to urge cancer patients, if they wanted to get well, not to sleep in the same place where they slept when they realized their illness. Can you imagine? It's obvious that these scientists are all observing, trying to interpret the same phenomenon, and it's also obvious that their theories and interpretations are not complete. Perhaps the most ancient civilizations had all the answers, but their knowledge was lost when those civilizations were destroyed. Maybe some secrets were kept by some religions, but this is very difficult to investigate. Perhaps the most authentic remnants of ancient knowledge are in the hands of the Chinese, who have practiced geomancy for millennia and consider it to be one of the most developed theories. As for Europe, the secret must not have been lost, at least not by some Christian priesthoods, for it's very easy to see that the cathedrals of Europe are on the nodal points of the grid lines. The theory of my colleague and good friend, a well-known biologist, Rupert Sheldrake, who believes that ideas, chemical compounds, DNA, forms resonate with the energy fields, also tries to answer the basic questions about the propagation of energy of the Earth and cause a morphing process in matter, causing their embodiment on the physical plane. The energy grid is related to the phenomenon of Schumann magnetic resonance, or Thor's thermometer, as many call it, which was predicted and identified by the German B. Schumann in the late 1950s. The Schumann effect is one of the first discoveries that led to the realization of the existence of the energy grid and its scientific documentation. In short, any electromagnetic disturbance at any point on the Earth affects the entire planet. For example, if a lightning strikes Athens, the electromagnetic echo of the lightning goes around the Earth 8 times in just 1 second. Can you imagine? When Schumann resonances were first observed, it was immediately understood that our planet behaves like a huge electronic circuit, which is designed to carry all information to all parts of the world. Wow! The flow of this electrical energy in the atmosphere is uninterrupted because over 1,000 electric storms occur at any given time throughout the planet. The most important characteristic of the phenomenon, however, is that the atmosphere of our planet pulsates at 7.8 hertz, exactly the same frequency as a human brain normally pulsates in its best state, the so-called alpha brain waves. But because the Earth's atmosphere is certainly older than the human brain, we assumed until recently that we were tuned by the Schumann effect to operate at this frequency and that no other frequency is natural to us. But when astronauts leave the Earth's atmosphere for long periods of time, they feel that they lose reality, quote unquote. And for this reason, NASA is currently installing Schumann generators in spacecraft which produce an electromagnetic field inside the spacecraft cabins that pulsates to the rhythm of 7.8 hertz. The Schumann effect can therefore be seen from a different angle. Since our brain normally with its alpha brain waves tunes to the 7.8 hertz of electric field oscillations in the atmosphere, this frequency is about 1/6 the frequency of the electricity supplied by the mains in your house. The first who discovered this atmospheric oscillation was Nikola Tesla. Then it clearly looks like an electromagnetic lock on consciousness imposed by the energy grid and not allowing us to change the channel. I have also talked to you about this locking, quote unquote, and I have explained to you that it is essential, the radio carrier wave, quote unquote, that tunes us all to a common channel, but it also seems to allow telepathic messages to be transmitted globally. Globally, yes. I also explained to you that studies have shown that changing brain frequency is not necessarily dangerous, as some researchers think. It just changes hormone production and affects emotions and perception. I emphasize the importance of the coincidence of the brain frequency with the energy grid frequency, because behind this coincidence is a very big secret, which we are still investigating and which I cannot yet reveal publicly. All of this shows roughly where we were in the early 1990s. Unfortunately, after our initial successes in exploring the nature of the energy grid, my group's enthusiasm began to wane. We could not decipher its deepest secrets, nor understand its essential nature or function. We were slowly realizing that we were missing some basic understanding, which was not allowing us to go deeper into the understanding of the grid. Nevertheless, a dangerous effervescence has begun to build in some circles of researchers. As we speak, various groups of power hunters are trying to appropriate and keep secret the research of the grid and its developments in the hope that they will be the first to learn all of its secrets and thereby rule the entire planet. While very few people started experimenting with the grid, today it's the focus of interest of various dark groups and scientists. But they managed to keep the subject buried since the general public cannot understand all this. The funny thing is, in fact, that to the layman, all of this often sounds unscientific. The purpose for which I wanted to talk about all this, I think, is obvious. It's imperative to inform about the issue and make public the secrets of the Earth's energy grid. Some have already begun to play with the planetary forces and experiment, not realizing the enormous power that lies there. They don't realize it because they have not delved into the issue. They explore it haphazardly overall, in all rush for applications rather than a full understanding, because it is the holy grail of natural planetary power, and they rush to get in first. They get it first. The energetic structure of our planet, the grid, is necessary for the maintenance of life and the evolution of all living organisms. The grid determines the path of storms, the direction of winds, the paths of underground waters, perhaps even the distribution of consciousness on the planet. If its knowledge evolves and remains in the hands of an irresponsible and selfish minority, it can prove utterly disastrous, and besides, no one else will be able to understand what is going on to deal with it. It's no longer a big secret that our planet is about to enter a new chapter in its history. The frequency of its rotation and the characteristics of its magnetic field will soon change, and new balances will be created, as well as new perceptual realities. Humanity, if it wants to survive, will have to face these changes with more maturity and with great mental flexibility. We will be forced out of things to leave the childish stage of our evolution. And this is amazing. I've translated this for you from a Greek article written by scientists, of course. Please leave your comments, and thank you for your support. Kindly support my Patreon account. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box below.